Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good evening, welcome to the show. An eventful day in Canberra and relief for mortgage holders out of the Reserve Bank meeting in Sydney. Everything you need to know coming up now on Credlin. Parliament's first sitting day for 2024 and a pretty cocky Prime Minister in question time today. The opposition decided not to stand in the way of Labor's tax changes, and some think that's the end of the broken promise. Well, I don't agree. Good but not great news for mortgage holders, with the RBA keeping the cash rate on hold, thank goodness, but not without warning that inflation is still too high and that further rate rises can't be ruled out. Ross Greenwood shortly with the latest. Plus, bad news overnight from Buckingham Palace. King Charles diagnosed with cancer. Now, this is not related to what he was admitted for. This is different. How serious is it? Well, Prince William now have to step up the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting down our way in October. And this mercy flight, we're told, from Prince Harry will cross to London with royal correspondent Sarah Hewson for the latest. And fed-up farmers descended on Parliament this morning, demanding Labor listen to their concerns about renewables on prime agricultural land. One of the organisers will join me later to explain why this matters to all of us and what's coming next.
That's going to change the whole environment, and they don't care. This is the whole thing. How could they sell off our country like this? It's Australia, for God's sake. We look after our country. I don't know who these people are, what planet they come from, but they need to go back.
But first, as expected, Peter Dutton has neatly sidestepped the trap the government thought it had laid out for him. In question time today, as I said, the Prime Minister, pretty cocky, was not happy with the Coalition's decision to not oppose Labor's broken promise on tax.
Come on. If you were fair income, you'd vote against our measure and you'd commit to roll it back.
You heard him. If you were fed income, he told Dutton, you'd vote against our measure and restore it. Now, sorry, PM. If you were fed income, you would just do what you've promised more than 100 times.
Labor will support all of the legislated tax cuts which are in place now. Of course, tax cuts were legislated earlier on in this term, and we've said that we won't seek to change those legislated tax cuts.
And I've said on the Stage 3 tax cuts that they've been legislated. People are entitled to operate on the basis of that certainty.
But look, Dutton's no fool. He's a Liberal and a Conservative at that. And no politician worth a Liberal name wants to stand between any worker and lower taxes. What the Coalition has decided to do here is to not oppose Labor's tax changes, to not oppose them. And that's an important distinction. It doesn't mean they support them. It doesn't mean that these are the tax cuts the Coalition would put through the Parliament if they were in power, because they are not. The Coalition stands by the original legislation. It is only the Prime Minister here who has broken his word. Now, that might sound like a semantic point, but it's not. Dutton isn't for this broken promise of Labor. He's just not stopping them putting it through the Parliament, letting these changes pass, if you will. And in doing so, he's denying Labor the wedge the PM clearly wanted and Labor's strategists hoped they would get as part of their desperate need to reset this struggling government. Labor wanted Dutton to oppose these changes. They wanted a fight with the Coalition so that they could try and paint them as uncaring on cost of living. Well, as the Coalition party room decided today, they're not blocking these changes. So there goes the wedge. Today, some in Labor were trying to run the line that Dutton's decision to let the cuts pass somehow makes the Prime Minister less of a liar after breaking his word, but that doesn't wash either. It's the Prime Minister who said, my word is my bond. It's the Prime Minister who's in charge of the government and, as a consequence, tax policy. And it's the Prime Minister who's broken his word.
My word is my bond. I can confirm that we haven't changed our position.
We have no change to our plans. Tax cuts will happen in July.
But let's be under no illusions about what's happened here, because it's important that Labor doesn't get away with trying to rewrite history, as so often they do. Lower income earners have already had 2 rounds of tax cuts. Stage 1, which came into effect in 2019, and Stage 2, which started in July 2022. Now, Stage 3, which was to begin on 1 July this year, was just enabling higher income earners to get ahead of the bracket creep that's been pushing up their tax for 15 years. Far from being a tax cut for the rich, it was just a measure of fairness for all. But remember two things I've said here this week. The first is that every taxpayer right now wants as much relief they can get, so any poll that shows support for these cuts doesn't surprise me. Now, that doesn't mean that voters like a liar in the lodge, and they can readily take the money now, of course they can, and punish the Prime Minister's lack of honesty later. Second, when people realise these tax cuts are less than $15 a week and not due anyway until the middle of the year, by which time there'll have been 2 automatic increases in petrol, more increases in power bills, groceries and more, I don't believe they'll be as grateful as some in Labor think. Julia Gillard's promise that there would be no carbon tax under a government I lead only became an albatross around her government's neck after months and months of work by the then opposition. If any of the cocky government MPs, Prime Minister included, think this is over, well, think again. You thought you'd won the voice too, but look how that imploded in your face. This morning, we thought we had some sunshine, didn't we? It looked like we might finally have our own domestic inquiry into the treatment of gender dysphoria, the condition where people feel trapped in the wrong body. As the Australian reported today, the South Australian Parliament was likely, it said, to support an independent MP's bid for a parliamentary inquiry, with Labor MPs reportedly pushing for a free or conscience vote on the issue. Now, I'm sorry to report that late this afternoon, the South Australian Premier killed off any chance that those Labor MPs might have had a conscience vote, with confirmation that Labor would now oppose any such inquiry. Now, why the cone of silence here? Why is every left-leaning MP in the parliaments around Australia blocking expert inquiries into an issue that we know is growing year by year? If the governments are so sure they're doing the right thing by our young people, then why are they so afraid to let health and medical experts speak? And parents too. In 2020 in South Australia, there were just 58 children and adolescents being treated for gender dysphoria. Just a year later, that number has more than doubled to 149. Now, this treatment can involve puberty-blocking drugs and hormone treatments. In some cases, it involves surgery that's impossible to reverse. And many are concerned that unlike just about every other condition, the treatment seems to involve more of the patient's diagnosis than that of expert doctors. Now, if otherwise healthy people suddenly announce they feel grotesquely overweight, for instance, and then deliberately starve themselves, doctors don't normally take their word for it and prescribe appetite suppressants. No, anorexic patients, they receive a range of mental health care and are encouraged to appreciate and love the body they're born with. But thanks to constant pushing from the extreme trans lobby, doctors are expected to affirm children's own assessment that they've been born in the wrong body. As a result, hundreds of young people who we don't trust to vote, to drink, to drive, or legally have sex have been trusted, though, to make the shattering and life-altering decision to take powerful drugs that could cause sterility, and in some cases with the involvement of the courts rather than parental knowledge, let alone permission, have their sex organs removed. It's an absolute scandal that we've allowed this madness to go largely unchecked without any expert inquiry up until now. In Britain, a government inquiry into this issue led to the closing down of the infamous Tavistock Clinic and the abandonment of so-called affirmative care for those mostly deeply troubled youngsters. And what the Tavistock inquiry has shown us, many of these young people are on the spectrum. They are gay, not trans, or they lack access to mental health support. In Australia, we've had nothing up until now, up until this talk today in the South Australian Parliament. even though young people who end up regretting their lack of care now only have courts as their redress, like the case of a Sydney woman currently suing her psychiatrist for negligence after undergoing the surgical removal of her breasts and her uterus after just one consultation when she was 19. Now, a 15-year-old girl who thinks she's a boy or vice versa normally needs help to overcome the doubts and anxieties that many teenagers have about their sexuality or identity. Confused young people need the best care modern medicine can provide, fact-based care, mental health support, not some medicos who seem keen to just agree with what a child merely declares without adequate contestability. And not in the case of young adults, chemical castration or surgical mutilation at the hands of a medical establishment that's been browbeaten into submission by the trans lobby. If we're serious about child protection, then an inquiry like this is what we urgently need. And at a federal level too, not just in South Australia. If the pro-trans lobby are so confident that this is right, then they should welcome an expert inquiry rather than run from one as they repeatedly try to do. And every doctor who believes in the Hippocratic oath of first, do no harm, well, they should be honour bound to support one. As I said, first sitting day of the year. Let's go to Canberra now. Sky News political reporter Trudy McIntosh.
Interest rates remain on hold after the first Reserve Bank meeting of the year. Falling inflation leading the RBA to keep the cash rate at 4.35%.
This is a decision which will be welcomed right around the country.
I'm a homeowner and I do feel the pinch.
In what will become a new tradition, Governor Michelle Bullock fronted the cameras in the wake of the decision.
It might be that there has to be more rate rise, but there might not be either. Nothing's in, nothing's out.
After a party room meeting, the opposition confirming it won't stand in the way of Labor's changes to the Stage 3 tax cuts.
We're supporting this change, not to support the Prime Minister's lie, but to support those families who need help now.
Peter Dutton has pledged to take a new significant tax policy to the next election, one that would tackle bracket creep.
I don't think we could credibly say that we're in a position to put forward that modified package today, but we're not saying that we're walking away from the principles.
The overhaul to tax relief has now been introduced to the House of Representatives.
It's about recognising that aspiration in this country is not and should not be limited to people who are already doing pretty well.
The first question time of the year dominated by the tax tussle and the Prime Minister's broken promise.
Will the Prime Minister rule out changing the current tax treatment of the family home?
They've had 2 weeks to think about their first question, and it has nothing to do with what we're doing, and something to do with something that no one will ever do.
Meanwhile, outside Parliament on the front lawn, hundreds of protesters rallied against proposed renewable projects across the country.
We've had a wind farm, and I hate using that term, approved next to us since March 2005. That's 19 years. There's been no work done on it. People can't make decisions to move on.
The people in this parliament need to start to act that carving this ground up is not the right thing.
Trudy McIntosh, Sky News.
All right, let's bring in Sky News political editor Andrew Clennell. Well, I mentioned first day back at school, and I tell you, I've been there long enough, it is like a boarding school on day one. How did it play out, Andrew?
Well, I think it played out the government's way, frankly, Peter, and the reason is because Peter Dutton had no choice but to go with the government's plan and say he'll have a later plan. Now, that's another chapter. This is a battle. We're talking about a war here in terms of the next election. And then you could see from the opposition questions, they didn't want to go there. The polls have told the story. The news poll, no doubt their own internals, what's happening in Dunkley. They just want to say, look, PM, get this thing through, your electoral bribe, I guess, on July 1, and let's get on with other matters. And the fact that you have broken a promise means you are going to break others. That's kind of where they are at. Albanese looked more confident than he's been for a long time. He was rocked by the voice. His colleagues told me that. I put that to him. There's no doubt that dented his confidence. To come in here with something to talk about, giving some extra money, as meagre as it might be, to lower and middle income earners, that was something for him to push and something to actually run with. And he didn't have anything much to run with last year except the voice, which didn't work, as you pointed out. And you pointed out correctly, you know, they were ahead in the voice and then things turned around. So things can turn around quickly, but it looks like the government's weak at this point.
Look, I'm not surprised the coalition didn't run on the tax cuts broken promise because they've basically just broken out of their own party room meeting to say that they were going to support them or not oppose them through the parliament. I mean, I've sat there in those questions committee. I mean, that does tie your hands, absolutely. And I don't think the lie plays out immediately. I think the lie now is this constant seed of doubt in the minds of voters between now and the next election that doesn't matter what the bloke promises them, how confident are they as voters that he will do what he says, that he won't backtrack, that he won't change his mind, that he won't be tricky on it. I do think his language there on that question regarding investment properties, negative gearing, was a bit of a dance around, as it was with Katie Gallagher, I think on your program on Sunday, and certainly Jim Chalmers. You know, they're all a little bit careful with their words, and you and I know that they've got all options on the table.
Well, Katie and Jim want to go further, right? Or perhaps Jim and Katie in that order. And Albanese won't let them. And that's one of the difficulties for the coalition, by the way, that he is pretty conservative on this stuff. A lot of the people underneath him probably talking to the Treasury officials and being yes-ministered a bit, but also trying to appeal to the left of the party in Jim Chalmers' case because he wants to win a leadership vote. They want to go further with some tax reform. And I said on Politics Now today, one of the disappointing things from my perspective is that they're always looking at ways to get more revenue. They're not looking at spending. And this is the opportunity for Peter Dutton because the NDIS is out of control. I think when he announces his tax package with a return to, and I think bigger tax cuts than stage 3, including at the higher end, he'll promise, I think he needs to look at something like means testing the NDIS to pay for it. I think that there is ground there to say, these guys spend too much. That's why they come after your money. We're going to give you back more of your money. And look, because this NDIS is out of control. And we hear the fraud stories and you hear anecdotally the double charging and overcharging that goes on. And you hear that, look, don't get me wrong, Peter, it's a noble thing. People profoundly disabled need this and that's good. But you cannot tell me the growth in this scheme is what it was intended for or what should be the case. The government's promised to address it.
Well, it wasn't.
I don't think they're doing enough. I don't think they're doing enough, and I think this is Dutton's opportunity because the government wants to yell at him, you're fiscally irresponsible, you won't be able to find the revenue for your extra tax cuts. This is the answer for him.
You can also bring in a gap payment because there are gap payments, as we know, with Medicare. There's not a gap payment in NDIS. I think that's also an issue. And I do think they've got to means test childcare. I mean, the idea in this country, there are people, households on $500,000 worth of income that are getting taxpayer support for childcare. I think that needs to be looked at very carefully. But I 100% agree with your point there about spending. I think there are a lot of politicians on both sides of the aisle, Andrew, who are pretty weak on the idea of reining in spending. They're all spooked after that 2014 budget, but we cannot continue the way we're going. You talk there about the Labor mood. I mean, it's a big call for the Labor caucus to listen to the Prime Minister say, back me, trust me, you know, come with me this year, I'll get us back in the game, because that was his line week in, week out on The Voice. We all saw what happened there, and that disastrous end of the year on home affairs and the detention, detaining issues, etc. But what's the general mood inside Labor? How do you pick it? What's the mood inside the coalition as well? Right. And the coalition?
Well, I think the coalition were hoping that he'd lose some paint over the broken promise, and it hasn't materialised in the fashion that they hope. So maybe they're a little bit down. That's where things are at the moment.
Yeah, I think this stuff plays out a while though.
Labor MPs are saying to me, look, a lot of people don't even understand the tax cuts yet. But some have been pleasantly surprised. I've had one or two saying their electorate is not going down so well. Others who have a lot of people on over 180 in their electorate reckon it's going okay. Reckon that because they have far more people on lower incomes, it's going okay.
I think punters, Andrew, will like the soak the rich rob Peter to pay Paul, take it off the rich and spread the tax cuts out. I think that plays to Labor's base. I don't think they're going to be happy when they see it's only $15 a week. I mean, that's gone with the petrol increases this week. And I will say it took us quite a while in 2010, 2011 to land the carbon tax broken promise on Julia Gillard. It doesn't happen overnight. And as I make the point, it's more about then the legacy that taints all the other promises from here on in. Just quickly, Dunkley by-election, what are you hearing?
I'm hearing there's a swing against Labor, but they'll probably hold on. And I think the other thing you need to factor in, though, which is a concern for the coalition, is we could see rate cuts at the end of the year and we will see more gimmies from the government in the budget. This is just the start of the cost of living relief.
Spot on. Handouts. Your cost of living relief is my handout, but there you go. All right, Andrew, well, I look forward to being on the desk with you for Dunkley. Thanks for your time. All right, the other big story, of course, around today, the RBA meeting today, keeping the cash rate on hold at 4.35%. That follows inflation falling to 4.1% for the December quarter. Retail spending, though, down in December. Unemployment holding steady at 3.8%. What does it all mean for not just your home loan, but for the economy? Let's get our money man in, Sky News business editor Ross Greenwood. Well, give us a sense first. We'll talk more broadly about the economy if I can, Ross, but if you've got a mortgage, breathing a sigh of relief tonight, but does this mean the worst of those cuts are behind us, or are they still on the horizon potentially?
Well, the cuts potentially are out there, but the Reserve Bank today has basically surprised markets by not becoming a little bit more, shall I say, relaxed about the future of interest rates. They're continuing to say that there is going to be, potentially another interest rate cut or more if they can't get on top of inflation. Now, it is worth considering already that a typical homeowner with a $750,000 mortgage is $21,000 a year worse off than what they were before. You can see here interest rates started to rise back in May 2022. So that's a big, big lump of money for a typical household who might be on average, $90,000, $95,000 is the average family income in Australia. So that just shows the impact of those rate rises. So the relief was going to be pretty much welcomed if it was there, but it wasn't there today. And I mean, regardless of state premiers, barracking for rate cuts today from the Reserve Bank, well, the Reserve Bank governor was too smart for that. She basically said, look, they've got their job to do. I've got my job to do. My job is to get on top of inflation, because if I don't, the hurt to Australian families, the hurt to Australia's businesses is going to be much, much worse in the long term. And that's where absolute credit to Michelle Bullock today. She showed independence. She did not kowtow to where government wants to be right now. She basically exerted the independence of the Reserve Bank and did say that inflation is the number one target that Australians need to be concentrating on.
How do you weight her comments against the comments from or a recent report from the OECD in relation to Australia saying monetary policy needs to remain restrictive, i.e. no fall in our rates?
Well, in fact, that's precisely what the Reserve Bank, I think, today has done. It's left the door open for more rate rises. Now, that's going to be a lot of shock to people who have heard in the past week or so, as inflation has trended down, that there could be 3 rate cuts by late this year, and indeed another 3 rate cuts by the middle of next year. But it's worth observing the Reserve Bank's own forecasts, which say that the inflation rate won't get back into its target band until the middle of next year, and won't get back until the middle of that target band until the middle of the following year. So that being the case, even its own assumptions of the economy do suggest that there could be 2 rate rises by the middle, or 2 rate cuts by the middle of next year. But, it really is still going to be a factor as to what happens with our inflation rate. What happens with the housing crisis right now that the government's presiding over, where that is causing inflation to rents? What's going to happen with the inflation crisis when it comes to insurance that continues to rise in so many parts of Australia? So these are all issues that don't go away. They're not imported inflation, as the government likes to say. It's homegrown, and that fundamentally is a problem for not just the Reserve Bank and households, but also for the government itself.
Look, and as you remind us, you're talking about a $20,000 on average increase in people's mortgage over the period of that graph we saw before of the rate rises. Of course, that's after tax dollars. Yep. Quick comment, because I know you can read a P&L pretty well. We haven't seen the modelling behind Chris Bowen's announcement in relation to electric vehicles and their efficiency standards, but no modelling's been put out. Well, experts say that's a good cause for worry. They won't release the modelling. A lot of concern from people like Motor Trades Association of Australia saying, they say it's going to be a $1,000 saving, for sure, but where's that? And a lot of these rules are going to impact utes and four-wheel drives, SUVs. Well, they make up 9 out of the top 10 best-selling cars in this country. What did you make of the Bowen announcement?
I was shocked by it, I will say. And I recognise they've got to have standards and where it goes. But if you consider Australia as a country where driving long distances is the norm as compared with European countries on which the government is basing many of its assumptions, where the distances driven are much, much shorter and certainly their cities are congested and have better public transport systems. So from that point of view, until the technology is significantly better and really the price of those electric vehicles comes down significantly, then Australians are going to do exactly what they're doing now, and that is drive petrol-driven cars and diesel-driven cars because they are the vehicles that are best suited for them and their lifestyles. So, the government has got a really significant job on its hands to convince Australians, and the way to do that is not simply to tax people almost out of their cars, it's to basically try and wait until the technology is better to then have the case for people to be economic, but also from a practical point of view to get into those electric vehicles.
Well, 2030 is not so far away now, only 6 years. Ross Greenwood, thank you. All right, after the break, that political fight over the PM's big lie, it will define the next election. Some tricky language too from Linda Burney over Labor's ongoing treaty plans, despite your vote in The Voice. And that big protest today at Parliament House against Labor's green agenda, one of the organisers, up next. Welcome back. Shortly, that renewables rally in Canberra today. What's next as organisers say they'll continue their fight against solar and wind farms they say are desecrating farmland and regional communities. But first, returning to the Stage 3 tax cuts, Coalition not opposing Labor's changes while rightly criticising the Prime Minister for his broken promise. Now, it's worth noting that this isn't the Coalition voting for Labor's bills, rather waving it through with a pledge of taking their own policy for simpler and fairer taxes to the next election. Joining me now to discuss this and more, Shadow Attorney General Michaelia Cash. Michaelia, thank you for your time. The PM's trying to use the Coalition changing your mind as somehow moving on from his broken promise. This is different, though. You haven't let him go on that issue, have you?
Absolutely not. There's only one liar in the lodge, Peter, and that is Anthony Albanese. This is the Prime Minister of Australia who looked Australians in the eye knowingly and repeatedly and lied to them. It is because of the Prime Minister's lies and broken promises that the Stage 3 tax cuts, as legislated, it's now impossible to deliver them. And why do we say that? Because you'd need to find, Peter, around $9 billion extra per year. And as you know, that is no easy feat. But what did the Prime Minister do? Let's have a look at what he did. He took the money that was in the Stage 3 tax cuts, he applied it to his own policy. And then you've got to say to yourself, now, why would he do that? Well, Peter, as you and I know, because he needed a political dividend before the Dunkley by-election. That's the decision of the Prime Minister. Political dividend in Dunkley. He has lied to Australians and he has trashed his reputation in the process.
He said, the Prime Minister, in mid-January on camera before the Parliament returned that he was backing in those tax cuts. He would do as legislated. Your colleague Jane Hume found out in Treasury questioning the other day, I think it was yesterday, that in fact that the Treasury officials were working on revised tax cuts way back in December.
Absolutely. You cannot trust a thing the Prime Minister says going forward. This is a man who, prior to the election, Peter, made so many promises. He is failing to deliver on so many of them. Let's start on the $275 reduction in your energy bill. They can't even mention the word 275. Then you have a look at the legislated tax cuts. Over 100 times he looked Australians in the eye, up until recently, Peter, and he said, my word is my bond. So, Peter, when they now talk about negative gearing, franking credits, and the family home, and they say, we're not going to touch them, what I say to Australians is this.
No one believes
you have
them.
a liar in the lodge. Don't believe a word this Prime Minister says. If you do, it's to your detriment.
Yeah, it's a big call to trash your Prime Minister's reputation for all of $15 a week. And I think when Australians work out that's all they get for this broken promise, I think that's where the tables will turn. Let's go to some other issues related to your portfolio. This struck me as extraordinary. The CFMEU and WA have got a 25% pay rise deal. Construction workers will go from $152,000 a year to $194,000 a year. Now, I don't begrudge workers getting a decent pay rise, but this is 25%. We've got insolvencies. Over 800 companies have gone to the wall in construction alone. And of course, we saw yesterday the massive company St Heliers, well, they've gone under. This is not going to help our housing woes, is it?
Peter, like you, I don't begrudge anybody a pay rise. The issue, however, with the unions negotiating these types of agreements is you've got to ask, what's the productivity increase? Because it's only with a productivity increase do you A, get increased prosperity, and B, sustainable wage rises. But what does worry me is what the CFMEU are saying they want to do in Western Australia, my home state. They basically want pattern bargaining. So in other words, they want to apply to construction industry in Western Australia this one-size-fits-all policy. Now, Peter, how does that work for business? Businesses, in particular in the construction industry, they are of different shapes, they are of different sizes. And I really question the capacity of smaller and medium businesses in the construction industry to actually survive if these types of terms and conditions are actually imposed on them via pattern bargaining. And ultimately, Peter, who loses out? The community. Why do the community lose out? Because they pay more. They pay more for roads, they pay more for schools, they pay more for hospitals.
But Kelly, what about reports today that Labor's put a loophole into its IR legislation that could allow union thugs and criminals back onto work sites?
Yep.
They used to have an entry permit, as I understand.
Right of entry permit.
What's going on here? What's going on here?
You got to love this one, Peter. Yep, so they don't talk about it before the election. They don't talk about it during the consultation phase of the bill. They don't put it in the legislation, but then they do a deal and miraculously this clause appears. That's transparency under Anthony Albanese. But let me tell you what it is. Under this, if a union official without a right of entry permit is invited onto a site by a health and safety representative, they have to be given entry. But what does this mean in reality? Well, Peter, a union official who's failed the fit and proper person test, they can now go onto site. A union official who's actually been stripped of their right of entry permit, perhaps, I don't know, criminal behaviour, bullish behaviour, thuggery, they can now go onto site. So again, big clap for Tony Burke and Anthony Albanese, because who have you delivered for? Nothing more and nothing less, the union movement in Australia, to the detriment of employers.
Just before we go, last night on the ABC, former PM Malcolm Turnbull, he called Peter Dutton a thug. He said Scott Morrison was duplicitous. And this is what he had to say about a former colleague, Matthias Cormann.
God, Matthias has put on a lot of weight, since 2018. He looks very kind of lean there, sort of almost. I recall it well. But, at least Michaelia Cash looks appropriately ashamed of what she's doing.
You know the Liberal Party rank and file better than anyone, Michaelia. How are they going to remember Malcolm Turnbull?
Well, Peter, I thought those comments were incredibly disappointing, in particular coming from a former Prime Minister. I personally, and you as well actually know this, We worked in the coalition government 9 years. Do you know what I would have focused on, Peter? I would have focused on the great achievements of the former coalition government. I would have focused on what we achieved, in particular throughout the COVID period. And in relation to Peter Dutton, I am very proud of the way Peter is leading the coalition, in particular a united coalition as we head towards the next election. But in particular, everything that Peter Dutton is doing to expose Mr Albanese as the liar in the lodge and to hold this disastrous Labor government to account. That's what I would have focused on.
All right, we'll leave it there. We'll both be polite and hold our tongues tonight. Makadia, thank you. All right, let's go to the Labor march towards net zero, because that sent a whole lot of farmers and regional Australians marching of their own on the way to Canberra today, protesting against the imposition of renewables and transmission lines across prime agricultural land. The national rally against Reckless Renewables was on the lawns today at Parliament House, and a whole lot of people addressed the forum. Senator Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price, Barnaby Joyce, Matt Canavan, Pauline Hanson, Bob Katter, all of them calling on federal and state governments to rein in their costly and destructive wind and solar farms and, as I said, all of those transmission lines. One of the organisers is a cattle farmer. He's the chair of the National Rational Energy Group, Grant Piper. He was there and he joins me now. Well, Grant, I've got to say, farmers are busy. I've got a family of farmers. You've got no time to yourself. So what motivated you to do the hard yards to organise this rally today?
Oh, well, it was a whole group effort, and we've got a great team and motivated people and competent people. And really, I got involved because, we're going to be overbuilt and surrounded in the Central West Arana Res. And it's the last straw on top of a whole lot of, I think, total misgovernance that a lot of people are suffering under. And I just felt like I had to do something.
What's your biggest concerns in relation to your place?
Oh, just ruining the whole district and the farming capability of the district over time. It will erode our productivity in time and the whole district, I think, because land will be taken out of production, whether the farmer who owns that land now thinks that will happen or not. But what tends to happen in these situations is the hosts move away, or if they're drawing income off wind or solar, well, obviously they don't need to work the land as much to produce food. So our food production will drop in time. There's a lot of environmental damage locally as well. And there's a lot of damage up and down, like you've seen the videos from North Queensland, and that's happening right across the country. I mean, these things don't have a minimal impact on the land. They have a huge impact on the land. And so the local environmental damage is immense. But what I don't understand is the total life cycle costs of these things means that on a planetary scale, if you're worried about emissions or pollution or consumption on a planetary scale, these things are totally counterproductive, because you've got to mine more minerals, you've got to transport, manufacture, install, rehabilitate, replace, 3 times for the life of a normal thermal power station, and all that work is done using fossil fuels at present, and they're so inefficient as a machine that they consume more and produce less power. So if you want the same amount of power in our civilization now, we're obviously going to consume more resources. So they're counterproductive. So the people that just blab out that they're cheap and reliable ignore the fact that they're just going to destroy the environment quicker and cause immense local damage as well. And I don't understand how they forget that, or they don't mention it, and no one seems to critique it, but hopefully we're bringing that into focus.
There's a lot of concern with the ownership of these wind farms, solar farms. They get passed on to foreign nationals. A lot are owned now by the Chinese, and concerns that all these plans for remediation, when they are no longer powering, we're talking 15 years for wind farms, probably about 25 for these large-scale solars. Any confidence that the land will be returned to the state it is now?
Oh, I've no confidence at all, no. I mean, the timescale is just great enough that the current owner probably thinks he doesn't have to worry about it, and certainly the current government doesn't have to worry about it. And when you question the proponents, they say, oh no, that's in the agreement with the landowner, which is commercial in confidence. So, we've got it in the agreement, but we all know these companies come and go, some of these projects have been sold several times before they even get built, and once built, they change hands again. And it's just an investment vehicle. It's a financial scam. It seems so transparent to most normal people, but it seems utterly opaque to the political class or the financial industry. I mean, we had a bit of a standoff with Bob Brown this week, I guess a little bit of conversation. We invited him along and he declined. And I mean, he's worked his whole life in the green movement, and I must admit I had respected it for him in the past for his principles, and I still do, but I don't think he's moved on to the 21st century where he realises that the green movement has been hijacked by the financial establishment and is now just a tool to clobber Western civilisation. And that things have changed. It's not the 20th century anymore, and it seems like we've got to up our game if we're going to stop this rubbish.
Well, keep up the fight. We're with you here on this network, and certainly here on this program. You're welcome anytime. And I might add here, you didn't see or speak with the Minister, have much contact at all with Labor politicians, but good on you for being there, Grant. Thank you for your time. Viewers, if you want to get involved, rally against recklessness on Facebook. Get there and support Grant and his team, because this is just starting. After the break, you won't believe how many failed asylum seekers in the UK are exploiting a new loophole in order to avoid being deported. Plus, that update will cross to London, King Charles, and that shock cancer diagnosis overnight. Well, last night I brought you the story of a failed asylum seeker who was repeatedly knocked back after entering the UK illegally, who was then allowed to stay after he said he converted to Christianity. Well, now the headlines in the UK Today report at least 40 other asylum seekers on the Bibi Stockholm barge. This is one of those taxpayer-funded accommodation setups to manage the influx. Well, they have all started attending Christian church services. And this is giving rise to growing fears that Christian conversion may be the new loophole that's being exploited to remain in Britain. To discuss this and more, let's bring in my international panel for tonight, Sky News contributor Kosha Garda, former Labor MP Michael Danby. Well, thank you both. Kosha, it seems this is a loophole that's now absolutely being exploited.
It certainly does, Peter, and it's so interesting. I mean, there's even fictional Hollywood understood a long time ago that this can happen. If you define criteria, people are always going to take advantage of that and figure out how to mold their cases to fit the criteria. I say that because The West Wing had an episode about this where there were Chinese refugees that were claiming that they were Christian, and President Bartlett in that episode said, well, how do we know that they are? We should test them. And he quizzed them on the 12 apostles. And I just say that to make the point that it's so well known. Even Hollywood talks about it. Here we are, though, where you've got a system that aids and abets, from NGOs to even the church to the official legislation. And you're going to find people taking advantage of it until such time as there's political will. And there's a spectrum you can do, improve the vetting, or all the way to have a moratorium on asylum altogether. But until we have that political will, I unfortunately think we're going to keep seeing things like this happen.
Michael, I don't know what the rules are or the doctrine is in the Jewish religion, but I know the Christian religion frowns on people claiming to have changed faiths when they haven't. But Islam actually has a provision called taqiyya, which allows a Muslim to pretend to have converted to Christianity. Now, this bloke was a convicted sex offender, so not good character. He did not meet the test of a refugee under international law. But here he is saying he's now a Christian. He gets to say, I think if there's 40 today, there'll be 400 in a couple of weeks' time. I think UK here is being played for mugs.
Well, I think we should go back to the West Wing and test people on what Christianity or being gay means. I think it's also the case here, Peter, that if you profess this, you basically have to have it considered as part of your asylum claim. And the priest who worked on this bloke's behalf to say he had legitimately converted to Christianity ought to be it's disgraceful. And asylum officers in both Britain and Australia ought to be able to ask people what being gay means, without being personally nasty, and what does being a Christian mean, and ask them some of the doctrines.
All right, that's my homework for the week. Hey, Kosha, the latest out of the US, Biden wins the Democratic primary in South Carolina, but really wasn't running against anyone. And what's all this talk about Michelle Obama?
That story, I think, continues because, there's this disconnect where people see that the Democrat machine will continue. And so long as Biden is the chosen front runner, he is going to continue to win because, as you mentioned, there's no opposition. And yet at the same time, everybody can see his decline physically, mentally, and all the rest of it. There is this issue with where if people step over him and skip over Kamala Harris, how would that work with the Black America portion of the electorate, which is a core piece of the Democrat electoral strategy if you do away with Kamala Harris? And Michelle Obama seems to be somebody who ticks all those boxes, solves all those problems, so it's fashionable to tout her name about. I still find it hard to believe that she would want this, given the life that she has right now, but you never know. It's US politics and anything's possible.
Anything's possible. Michael, we had our Prime Minister go and kowtow in Beijing. We've given them free rein on the port of Darwin. I think everything they've wanted, they've got under the Albanese government. But now China is making it clear that they are in charge. They have sentenced an Australian to death. They're prepared to commute the sentence to life. But that's effectively where we are tonight. This is supposedly what a good relationship looks like with China.
Well, it's very much going in the other direction, Peter. You're dead right. The Port of Darwin, they want us to fear them. They released one of the journalists, but China is not our system. Thank heavens we blocked that extradition treaty that could have pressured 1.2 million Chinese Australians with even more fear from being extradited back to the mainland. But it doesn't stop the pro-Beijing lobby. Bob Carr and 50 other ex-academics and politicians are demanding that the Albanese government, despite this arrest, have a new policy of engagement with China.
Michael and Kosha, thank you both for your time. Let's cross now to London. That news overnight that King Charles is being diagnosed with cancer came as a bit of a shock because we'd had those earlier assurances that his prostate issue was benign. However, we're now told that this is not the source of his cancer. We know too Princess Kate, she's now the Princess of Wales, Kate Middleton. She's home after 2 weeks in hospital with abdominal surgery. Join me now, Talk TV Royal Editor, Sarah Hewson. Well, great to have you back on the show, Sarah. I tell you what, the Royals are making news for a lot of health woes at the moment, but this is really serious, isn't it?
Yeah, and this was a shock announcement yesterday, Peter, because we'd seen the King last week walk out of hospital in London. We saw him just on Sunday walking to church on his Sandringham estate with Queen Camilla. And then yesterday evening, we got the news that he had been diagnosed with cancer. Look, we don't know what kind of cancer. We don't know the type of time frames involved in the treatment that he started yesterday as an outpatient. But we have had word in the last few minutes here from the British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, who says thankfully the King's cancer was caught early, which will be reassuring to many, and that hopefully he'll be making a speedy recovery. He's going to be carrying on his state and constitutional duties from behind the scenes, so he'll still be meeting the Prime Minister, he'll still get his red boxes, he'll be holding Privy Council meetings to give royal assent to new laws, for example. What we're not going to do is see him out there in public.
We know that Kate was in hospital for 2 weeks now. That is serious in the modern era, particularly when she could go home with the best nursing care in the world. So we still don't know what the origins of her illness is. She's out till Easter. I assume we're talking about chemo here with the King. We don't know how long he's out. Who's going to step up in his absence? And this talk too that Harry's on his way home. What's that all mean?
Yeah, Harry is on his way home. He was spotted at Los Angeles airport and he is due to be returning here to the UK at some point today to visit his father, coming on his own without Meghan and the children. I think that will be very welcome for the King. We've always been told that despite the split between Buckingham Palace and Montecito and the tensions between the two sides, his King's door has always been open and he wants his son back. I think it will be of great comfort to him. What we're not so clear on is whether Prince William will be as welcoming of his brother's return. Look, these are two boys, two brothers who lost their mother, who are now facing the diagnosis of their father with cancer. You can only hope that an event like this serves to bring families back together, and this might be the start of some kind of rapprochement, but those wounds run deep. And Prince William, as you mentioned, has a lot of challenges on his hands. He's got to step up to fill in some of the King's duties while also also looking after his wife, Kate, at home and trying to give some kind of normality to their 3 children while she is out of action until April.
Sarah, that's comprehensive. We'll watch this closely. We'll speak to you again if there's more news. Thank you for joining us tonight. Right, that's it for me. Tomorrow night at 6, we'll be back here as always. Busy parliamentary week. It'll keep going at a pace. I'll see you then.